The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy gas station, where people bustled in and out, filling up their cars and grabbing snacks. The hum of everyday life buzzed in the background, until the sharp, unmistakable crack of a slap cut through the air like a gunshot. Conversation stopped, heads turned, and for a brief moment, silence swallowed the scene. Jamal Williams, a 13-year-old boy with deep brown eyes and a quiet nature, stumbled backward, his hand instinctively flying to his stinging cheek. His sketchbook, once clutched tightly in his hands, tumbled to the pavement, pages fluttering in the warm breeze. He looked up, his wide, teary eyes locking onto the towering figure before him. Officer Ryan Calloway, standing rigid in his neatly pressed uniform, his mouth curled into a smirk of cold authority. "I said, get out of the car," Calloway barked, gripping Jamal's wrist and yanking him forward like he was nothing more than a rag doll. The badge on his chest gleamed under the golden sunlight, but there was no mistaking the venom in his voice, the contempt dripping from every word. Jamal's voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't doing anything, sir. I was just waiting for my dad." "Shut your mouth," Calloway snapped, his grip tightening. His gaze darted around the gas station, scanning the onlookers. "Kids like you think you can hang around wherever you want. Not on my watch." The crowd had started to gather, murmurs growing louder. Then, from the other side of the car, a man stepped forward. He moved with deliberate calm, his expression unreadable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark jeans and a crisp polo shirt. Unassuming, yet something about him made those who met his gaze take an instinctive step back. Calloway's sneer widened. "You got something to say?" he taunted. "Maybe you should teach your kid some respect before he ends up in real trouble." The man's voice was low, deliberate. "Let him go." Calloway laughed hollowly, shaking his head. "Or what? You think you're someone important?" A hush fell over the crowd. The tension thickened, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across Calloway's face. The man took a step closer, his eyes unwavering. "Do you even know who you just put your hands on?" And with that, the moment shifted. The officer had no idea his worst mistake had just begun. A tense silence hung over the gas station as the crowd held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Officer Ryan Calloway squared his shoulders, his confidence swelling in the face of the unassuming man who had dared to challenge him. He had been in situations like this before, civilians who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. They never could. "Let me guess," Calloway sneered, his grip still tight on Jamal's wrist. "You think you're someone important? Think your words matter to me?" Jamal's father, Derrick Williams, remained still, his face unreadable, his hands steady at his sides. There was no anger in his expression, no fear, no panic, just a chilling calmness that unsettled those who were paying close attention. Calloway took a step closer, now fully towering over Derrick, trying to intimidate him the same way he had done with countless others before. "Look, pal, I deal with your kind every day. Always think you can talk your way out of trouble." His lips curled into a smirk. "You're making a mistake." Derrick's voice was measured, his words deliberate. "No," he said quietly, locking eyes with the officer. "You are." The words cut through the humid air like a blade, sending an unmistakable ripple through the gathered crowd. The bystanders exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder. Calloway rolled his eyes and, with a flick of his wrist, shoved Jamal toward the car. The boy stumbled, barely catching himself before hitting the pavement. Derrick took an instinctive step forward, his jaw tightening, but he held himself back. The crowd gasped. Some raised their phones, their cameras rolling. "You don't get to do that," Derrick said, his voice dropping an octave. Calloway's smug expression faltered for just a moment before returning. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Derrick didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened his posture, his presence alone demanding attention. "Do you even know who you just put your hands on?" The question sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the bystanders. Calloway chuckled, though there was now a slight edge of uncertainty in his voice. "No, and I don't care. You think a badge like mine takes orders from people like you?" For a long, heavy second, silence settled over them. The kind of silence that makes people lean in, that makes bystanders stay just a little longer to see what happens next. Then, Derrick took a slow step forward. "No," he said, his voice steady. "But you will." Calloway's smirk twitched, his bravado cracking just enough to reveal something darker beneath it. He took another step, now chest to chest with Derrick, looming over him. Now that a threat. Derrick didn't flinch. His hands remained loose at his sides, his voice controlled. It's a fact. The weight of the moment was palpable. The crowd, now fully engaged, whispered among themselves. Then, a voice broke through. One of the bystanders, a young woman in a business suit, her voice laced with recognition. "Wait," she murmured, eyes widening. "That's Derrick Williams." More whispers followed. Recognition dawned across the gathering faces. One by one, people started piecing it together. Calloway remained oblivious, too caught up in his own arrogance. "Do you know who that is?" someone whispered. "That's Derrick Williams," another voice echoed, now louder, now confident. Still, Calloway didn't catch on. His focus remained on Derrick, convinced he was dealing with just another man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Derrick inhaled deeply, glancing at his son, who was still clutching his sketchbook to his chest, his face red from both humiliation and the lingering sting of the slap. Then, Derrick turned back to Calloway and delivered the words that would unravel everything. "I'm the chief of police." The gas station went silent. For the first time that day, Calloway's face lost its color. A few beats passed before he blinked, as if his mind was struggling to catch up with reality. "You're lying," he scoffed, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. Derrick reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black badge case, and flipped it open. The golden emblem gleamed under the gas station lights. The air around them seemed to shift as every set of eyes locked onto that badge. Calloway's breath hitched. "You just assaulted the son of your commanding officer," Derrick said, his tone unshaken. The crowd erupted into hushed, shocked gasps. Calloway took a step back, his fingers twitching as if debating whether to reach for his radio or run. His entire demeanor shifted, from arrogant authority to pure, unmistakable panic. The murmurs of the onlookers turned into full-blown conversations. Phones were lifted higher, more cameras zoomed in, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming the worst mistake of Calloway's career. "You?" Calloway stammered, searching for a way out. "You can't be serious." Derrick didn't move. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Calloway swallowed hard. The weight of his actions, the sheer magnitude of his error, was finally sinking in. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to seal his fate, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The crowd parted slightly as another police cruiser pulled into the gas station lot. A younger officer stepped out, his brows furrowing as he took in the scene. His gaze flickered between Derrick, Jamal, and Calloway before his jaw clenched. "Officer Calloway," he said, his voice laced with something almost like regret. "Step away from them." Calloway opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Derrick exhaled slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life ensuring justice was served. "It's over, Officer Calloway." And for the first time in his career, Calloway had no choice but to believe it. The gas station lot, once buzzing with casual conversations and the mundane rhythm of daily life, had now become the epicenter of something far greater. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air. Officer Ryan Calloway, the once smug enforcer of authority, stood motionless, his face pale, his arrogance evaporating like mist under the setting sun. The younger officer who had arrived on the scene, Officer Kevin Monroe, took another step forward, his gaze flickering between Derrick Williams, Jamal, and Calloway. Monroe's face betrayed a mix of emotions, uncertainty, recognition, and something dangerously close to regret. "Officer Calloway," Monroe said again, his voice firmer this time. "Step away." Calloway's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers twitching by his belt as if still clinging to the last remnants of control. His entire body was wound tight, his breath uneven. This is ridiculous," he finally stammered, his voice no longer carrying the same bravado as before. He never identified himself. "I was just doing my job." Derrick tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Calloway's with an unshakable resolve. "Your job?" he repeated, his voice measured but edged with steel. "Your job is to serve and protect. Tell me, Officer Calloway, who exactly were you protecting when you struck my son?" A murmur spread through the gathered crowd, their hushed voices weaving together like the rising tide. Phones remained raised, cameras still rolling. Every second of this moment was being documented, immortalized beyond Calloway's ability to rewrite the narrative. The officer shifted his weight uneasily, his mind scrambling for an out. I didn't know, he muttered, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of his own crumbling defense. I thought he was. Derrick took a step forward, his voice quiet but commanding. You thought he was what, Calloway? He pressed. A threat? A criminal? Because he was sitting in a car, drawing in his sketchbook while waiting for his father? Calloway opened his mouth, but found no words. Officer Monroe exhaled sharply before pulling out his radio. Dispatch, I need a supervisor and internal affairs at my location immediately, he said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling around him. Calloway's head snapped toward Monroe, his expression shifting from panic to outright desperation. Wait, Monroe, don't do this, he hissed under his breath. You know what this means for me. Monroe's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing around his radio. Yeah, he murmured. I do. A long silence stretched between them, and in that moment, Calloway understood. There was no escape from this. The sirens grew louder. Calloway exhaled, his entire frame deflating. His hand, which had hovered dangerously close to his belt, fell limply at his side. His gaze drifted back to Derrick, then to Jamal, who was still gripping his sketchbook with trembling fingers. Calloway started, but Derrick cut him off with a single look. You don't get to explain this away, Derrick said, his voice firm. Not this time. The first cruiser pulled into the lot, followed closely by an unmarked vehicle. Two officers stepped out, one of them a senior-ranking sergeant, his expression unreadable as he approached. Behind him, an internal affairs investigator emerged, his gaze already locked onto Calloway. Derrick turned to his son, resting a steady hand on his shoulder. It's over, son, he said softly. Jamal looked up at his father, his wide, teary eyes searching his face. Is it? He whispered. Derrick nodded. Yes. And now, we make sure this never happens again. As Calloway was led away, his badge and weapon stripped from him, the gas station crowd erupted into hushed conversations, their voices thick with disbelief, anger, and something else, hope. A reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The weight of the moment didn't fade as Calloway was escorted toward the waiting police vehicle. The gas station parking lot, once just another mundane stop in people's daily routines, had become something far more significant. A battlefield where justice had begun its slow but inevitable course. The gathered crowd, though still murmuring among themselves, knew they had just witnessed something rare, accountability in real time. Jamal stood close to his father, his small frame still trembling. He clutched his sketchbook tightly, his fingers curled around its worn edges like it was his only tether to reality. The sting of Calloway's slap still burned on his cheek, but it was the shame and fear that lingered deeper, cutting into him like a wound that wouldn't close. Derrick felt his son's tension and gently placed a steady hand on his shoulder. You're safe now, he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of both a promise and a responsibility. Jamal's lips pressed together as he lowered his gaze. It didn't feel like it back there, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Derrick exhaled slowly, his chest tightening at the quiet pain in his son's voice. I know, he said, his own voice low. And that's why we fight to make sure no one else has to feel that way again. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Officer Kevin Monroe, the younger officer who had stepped in when it mattered, now stood in front of Derrick. His posture was uncertain, as if he were caught between duty and conscience. Chief Williams, Monroe said, his voice measured, respectful. Derrick turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Monroe hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to say, I should have spoken up sooner. I've seen Calloway pull stunts like this before, but I never called him out. Maybe if I had, today wouldn't have happened. Derrick studied him for a long moment before replying. You had a choice to make, Officer Monroe, he said finally. And today, you made the right one. That matters. Monroe let out a slow breath, relief flickering in his eyes. Internal Affairs is going to need a statement, he said. I'll make sure the truth is in the report. Derrick nodded. Good. That's how we start fixing this. Monroe hesitated again, then asked, Do you really think we can fix it? The system? Derrick's gaze was steady, unwavering. We don't have a choice. If we don't, more kids like my son will keep paying the price. Monroe gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. Then, as if suddenly aware of the eyes still on him, he turned and walked toward the growing group of officers handling the situation. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated Calloway's face as he was placed into the back seat of a squad car. His once confident smirk was long gone, replaced with a hollow, distant look. He wasn't just losing his badge. He was losing the illusion of invincibility that had shielded him for so long. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others quietly discussing what they had just witnessed. But one thing was certain. The video footage from their phones would not stay silent. Derrick turned back to his son. "Come on, let's go home." Jamal hesitated, his grip on his sketchbook tightening. "Is he going to jail?" he asked. Derrick sighed. "That's up to internal affairs now." Jamal looked up at him, eyes full of something between uncertainty and frustration. "But what if they just let him go? What if nothing changes?" Derrick crouched down, meeting his son's gaze. "Then we keep pushing," he said. "We hold them accountable. We make sure that this story gets heard. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen." Jamal nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his expression. The ride home was quiet. Derrick glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, watching as Jamal traced the edges of his sketchbook absent-mindedly. He was processing everything, reliving the moment in his head over and over. When they pulled into the driveway, Derrick turned off the engine but didn't move right away. "Jamal," he said gently, "you want to talk about it?" Jamal shook his head, staring out the window. "Not right now." Derrick respected that. He knew healing took time. Inside, the house was warm, familiar. But even home didn't feel the same, not after today. Jamal sat on the couch, flipping through his sketchbook, though he wasn't really drawing. Derrick watched him for a moment before heading into the kitchen, pulling out the ingredients for dinner. Cooking had always been his way of grounding himself after tough days. Minutes later, Jamal's voice drifted in from the living room. "Do you think he regrets it?" Derrick paused mid-chop. He set down the knife and walked back into the living room, taking a seat beside his son. "Maybe," Derrick said. "Maybe he regrets getting caught more than what he did. Or maybe, for the first time in his life, he's realizing that what he did was wrong." Jamal frowned. "Do you think he'll change?" Derrick exhaled. "That's up to him. Some people change when they're forced to face the truth. Others just get better at hiding." Jamal was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "And what about the other ones?" he asked. "The cops like him that haven't been caught." Derrick's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That's why we keep speaking up. That's why we hold them accountable." Jamal finally set his sketchbook down and turned to his father. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Derrick smiled, though there was a tiredness behind it. "Not until there's nothing left to fight for." Jamal studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Then, for the first time that evening, he smiled, just a little. Derrick ruffled his son's hair and stood. "Now, how about you help me with dinner? We've earned a good meal tonight." Jamal got up, following his father into the kitchen. Today had been painful, ugly, but it had also been important. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone in it. The fallout from Officer Calloway's actions rippled through the city like a storm no one could ignore. The video footage spread across social media within hours, igniting outrage and demands for justice. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every second of the confrontation, and soon, the entire nation was watching. For Calloway, the world he had carefully built, one where his authority was never questioned and his power went unchecked, was crumbling fast. His superiors had no choice but to place him on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, but the public was not satisfied. Protests erupted outside the police department, citizens demanding not just Calloway's firing, but systemic change. Derrick Williams, once a quiet force within the system, found himself thrust into the spotlight. His refusal to back down, his calm but unshakable stance against Calloway's abuse of power, had made him a symbol of resistance. People wanted to hear from him. They wanted leadership. Yet, Derrick had never sought the role of an activist. He had spent years trying to change the system from within, believing in the integrity of the badge he wore. Now, as he watched the anger swell in the city he had sworn to protect, he wondered if he had been naive to think internal change was enough. A few days after the incident, Derrick received a call from the mayor's office. "We need to talk." The mayor's voice was tight, clipped. "This thing is getting bigger than we anticipated." Derrick wasn't surprised. That's because it was always bigger. People are just paying attention now. A long pause. Then, can you come in? Derrick agreed, but he already knew how the conversation would go. The mayor would try to calm the public without making any real promises. He would talk about trust and reform while carefully avoiding real accountability. Derrick had sat in too many of these meetings before to expect anything different. As he walked into City Hall, reporters swarmed him, microphones and cameras shoved toward his face. Chief Williams, do you believe Officer Calloway should be fired? Do you think the department is covering for him? What do you say to people who don't trust the system anymore? Derrick met their questions with the same measured composure he always had. I say that trust isn't built on words. It's built on action. And right now, the people are waiting to see if those actions match the promises being made. Inside, the mayor was already seated, along with the police commissioner and other city officials. The tension was thick. Chief, the commissioner started, we're in a tough spot. The department's reputation is on the line. Derrick leaned forward. It should be. A child was assaulted by one of our own. A child who did nothing wrong. The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, we're not here to defend Calloway. He's on leave, and Internal Affairs is handling the case. But we can't have the city tearing itself apart over this. Derrick's jaw tightened. Then give them justice. The room went silent. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking. That Calloway's case was not an isolated incident, and true justice would require dismantling the very structures they had spent their careers protecting. We'll take it under advisement, the mayor finally said, but Derrick heard the finality in his tone. They weren't going to act unless they were forced to, and the people weren't waiting for permission anymore. Outside, the protests grew. The names of other victims of police misconduct were chanted alongside Jamal's. Signs demanding justice filled the streets. Derrick knew that this wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about every black parent who had warned their child about the dangers of simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jamal, despite everything, had tried to move on. But Derrick could see the way his son flinched at the sound of sirens now. How he hesitated before getting into the car, his once unshakable trust in his father's protection now dented by the reality that even good men in uniform couldn't always keep the bad ones in check. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Jamal spoke up. What happens if he gets to keep his job? Derrick sighed, running a hand over his face. Then we keep fighting. We make sure the world doesn't forget what he did. Jamal was quiet for a moment, then asked, do you think he regrets it? Derrick's expression hardened. Maybe he regrets getting caught. But real regret? That comes with accountability. And that's something men like him don't usually face. Days later, the official announcement came. Calloway was being fired, and criminal charges were under review. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. Jamal watched the news with wide eyes, then turned to his father. Does this mean it's over? Derrick shook his head. No, son. It means we keep going. Because for every Calloway taken down, there were more just like him. And Derrick wasn't done fighting yet. The city had been on edge for weeks. The protests had started as a demand for justice for Jamal, but they had evolved into something much bigger, a call for systemic change. The firing of Officer Calloway had been a step in the right direction, but for many, it wasn't enough. The people wanted accountability, not just for one officer, but for an entire system that had allowed men like him to operate unchecked for so long. Derrick Williams watched from his office window as demonstrators filled the streets below. Signs demanding justice waved in the air, chants echoing between the city's buildings. He had never seen his city like this before, so unified, so determined. Yet he knew that change wasn't just about anger. It had to be about action. And action required leadership. When the news broke that Calloway had been officially charged with assault and misconduct, the city erupted. The announcement was met with both relief and skepticism. Relief that he was finally facing legal consequences, but skepticism over whether those consequences would be real or just symbolic. Derrick's phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. Does this mean we won? He sighed, typing back. It means we took a step, but there's still a long way to go. Jamal had been quieter since the incident, more thoughtful. He still carried his sketchbook everywhere, but the drawings inside had changed. Gone were the superheroes and futuristic cities he once filled the pages with. Now, his sketches were of people, protesters, police, the faces of those who had become symbols in the movement. His art was his voice, and Derrick could see that his son had found a way to express what words often couldn't. Meanwhile, within the police department, the fallout was just beginning. Calloway's indictment had shaken the force, but for many officers, it wasn't enough. The good cops, the ones who claimed to uphold justice, were being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Silence had made them complicit. One officer, a younger patrolman named Officer Grayson, approached Derrick in the hallway one evening. His face was pale, his eyes filled with hesitation. "Chief Williams," he began, shifting uncomfortably. I wanted to talk to you." Derrick folded his arms. "Go ahead." Grayson swallowed hard before speaking. "I've seen things. I never said anything before, but after what happened to your son, I can't stay quiet anymore." Derrick studied him for a moment. He had seen officers like Grayson before, men who wanted to do the right thing but were too afraid to stand against the culture of silence within the department. The fear of retaliation, of being labeled a traitor, often kept them in line. "You're saying this now," Derrick said slowly. "Why?" Grayson exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Because I don't want to be like them. I don't want to look the other way anymore." Derrick nodded. "Then don't." Grayson hesitated before adding, "I'm willing to testify. About Calloway. About others." It was a breakthrough, but Derrick knew that one officer's testimony wouldn't be enough to change an entire system. It would take more. Across the city, new policies were being drafted. The mayor's office, under mounting pressure, had begun pushing for police reform, body camera mandates, independent review boards, and mandatory bias training. Some officers pushed back, calling it anti-police rhetoric, but others, like Grayson, knew it was necessary. But policy wasn't the only thing changing. Jamal, despite everything, had been finding his own way to process what had happened. He had started sharing his sketches online, and to Derrick's surprise, they had gone viral. His drawings of the protests, of the fear and defiance in the faces of those demanding justice, had resonated with people far beyond their city. Journalists began reaching out, asking to feature his work. Activists shared his images, using them as symbols of the movement. One evening, as Derrick sat at the kitchen table, Jamal slid a drawing in front of him. It was a portrait, not of the protesters or the police, but of Derrick himself. "You're part of this too," Jamal said softly. Derrick stared at the sketch. It was him, standing tall, his shoulders squared, his expression serious but resolute. Jamal looked at him. "You always say change comes from the inside. You're proof of that." Derrick swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. He had spent years trying to change the system from within, but only now did he realize how much of an impact he had truly made. A few days later, he was invited to speak at a community meeting. He stood before a crowd filled with faces both young and old, police officers standing at the back, activists in the front. He took a deep breath. "I became a police officer because I believed in justice," he began. "But believing in justice isn't enough. You have to fight for it. And fighting for it means holding ourselves accountable." There were nods in the audience. "Some of us wear this badge with honor," he continued. "But too many have used it as a shield to avoid consequences. That stops now. Not just with Calloway, but with everyone who abuses their power." Applause erupted, but Derrick knew the real work was only beginning. As the meeting ended, Jamal stood by his side. "So," he asked, "what happens now?" Derrick smiled. "Now, we keep going. Because change wasn't about one case, one officer, or one protest. It was about making sure that what happened to Jamal never happened again. And that fight was far from over.